character in our series looking at the Bronze Age collapse in Egypt is a fairly mysterious guy about whom little is known for sure. And yet so poorly documented is the age of Total War Pharaoh that today's hero, Chancellor Bay, still manages to be only the third most mysterious of the 8 faction leaders who will be playable at launch. And so as usual, I'm distilling and interpreting here. Definitely let me know your perspective on the period down in the comments, or if you don't know much about the era, hit me up with questions down in the comments. Anyway, Bay is far and away the most politically astute man of his era. But because his heroism was much less of the battlefield sort, his great accomplishments get mentioned, but without much detail. The man we know as Bay is described as a man from the north, which could mean he was from northern Egypt, but more likely indicates that he was born in the Levant, perhaps around the region of Syria. We don't know exactly how he entered service, but given that the Egyptians controlled a substantial portion of Canaan, or that's modern-day Israel, around this time, it was relatively common for talented people from the region, who the Egyptians called Asiatics, lumping all the Asians together, into government positions. Bay changes his name as part of entering into Egyptian service, discarding his old, presumably Syrian name for the sycophantic Ramesses Chayimnetjer, meaning servant of the god Ramesses. This is common enough. Egyptians seem to have distrusted foreigners, and so Asiatics who attempted to integrate into Egyptian society will often adopt these patriotic-type names to loudly signal whose side they're on. Now, we don't know when exactly he entered into royal service. Given his apparent seniority even during Seti's administration, he could have been within the government in some capacity since the time of Ramesses the Great. We know nothing about what he did in his early years in the government, and he doesn't appear in any records until the height of Amenmessa's rule, some 4 years after Merneptah's death. At this point, Bay is Seti II's royal butler and scribe, which sounds sort of like a personal servant, but this was actually the title for a pretty senior administrator. Remember that they didn't have professional government in ancient Egypt initially. The administration of the realm had all evolved directly out of the king's household, and even though it had bureaucratized to a certain extent, it still retained a lot of the forms of personal, direct rule of the pharaoh over his personal possessions. Now, it isn't clear what he did here, but he was involved in some way in restoring Seti II to power after Amenmessa had taken over most of the country. Given his positions, he doesn't seem to have done this through force of arms, but rather he was likely involved in some sort of intrigue, or laid the foundations for a set of crucial alliances that helped Seti to return to Memphis after 2 years of being on the back foot. Whatever manipulations Bay pulled were significant enough that the scribe was given a special representation in Seti's burial shrine, which is a major distinction for a non-Egyptian, non-royal, though this isn't the greatest distinction that he's going to see in his career. For the next 2 years, Bay moved in the highest circles of Egyptian and also probably Canaanite or Syrian politics. He knew how to connect with people and get them on his side, and in the chaos of civil war and foreign encroachment, he went from strength to strength, creating a coalition who would depend on him for patronage and unity. At least, we think we did. We don't actually know any more about him for the next 2 years, but his next appearance in the historical record is a big enough deal that the man himself must have leveraged himself into a pretty significant force as Seti enters back into the capital for his great restoration. Now, Seti II dies after about 2 years of having the throne back from Amenmessa. His cause of death is unknown, but there are reasons that both natural death and conspiracy are each valid theories. But he died, it seems, with no living sons to his name, and thus the succession was once again thrown open. In order to prevent a further outbreak of civil war, our hero, Bay, with his political coalition, united with another power player, the now widow of former King Seti, Queen Tausret, and together they held enough sway to keep the nation from falling apart. However, neither of them were fully valid to be a pharaoh at this point. They both needed something to legitimize them. And so, in search of a puppet, they seem to have gone to the dollar store and bought the cheapest, most mangled and wretched off-brand puppet they could find. This poor, unfortunate soul was a 10-year-old boy named Siptah. Siptah doesn't have a lot going for him, and the erasure of history after his death means we know even less about a child who probably had little chance to do much with his power. He has a severe deformity in one leg, usually attributed to childhood polio, but some think it may be a form of cerebral palsy. Nobody really knows, doesn't really matter. His mother was a foreigner, a Syrian princess about whom little is known. His father, while probably well known in his own time, has now been lost to history and is heavily debated. The idea that he was the son of Seti II is pretty unlikely, both because it was an unusual, difficult succession, and because we would really expect to hear about that if it was the case. He probably wasn't a son of Merneptah, brother of Seti, again for much the same reasons. It could be that he's from some obscure branch of the royal house, one of Ramesses' many grandchildren, or even great-grandchildren at this point, but he does get described as the son of a king, which makes it quite likely that he was the young son of Amenmesse, who somehow survived the downfall of his father's reign. If this is the case, it is very interesting that a major official of Seti and Seti's wife would get together to support the son of Seti's major rival. Now, the reasons why they did it are pretty clear. There doesn't seem to have been a good number of valid options for proper succession at this point, as even though Ramesses had a ton of children, most of them seemed to be dead at this point, or for some reason not in consideration for the throne, while Merneptah and Seti both have no surviving kids of their own at this point, we think. More important than dynastic considerations, though, Siptah was chosen more than anything because he is incapable of ruling by himself. We see this most clearly in the art. Typically in Egyptian art, the most important person, be it the king or a god or the owner of a tomb, he gets depicted as being much larger than everyone else. Historically, there are depictions where the most important of royal wives or mothers can also be depicted at the same scale as the pharaoh. But for a civilian administrator, an acknowledged servant of the king, to be depicted at this scale as well, for all three of the royal triumvirate, Bay, Tausret, and Siptah, to be depicted together at equal height is unprecedented in Egyptian art. Bay, Tausret, and Siptah all start building individual tombs within the Valley of the Kings, all on grand scales. But as to what they actually did with all this power, they don't have much to show for anything. Certainly there was a bit of construction done during the 6 years that young Siptah reigned, but definitely no conquests. Indeed, rather the opposite may have been happening, as there are some indications that the Canaanite warlord named Ursu appeared during this period. Now, a good number of people think that Ursu is actually another name for Chancellor Bay, and they have pretty decent reasons for thinking that. However, I'm treating them like two separate people for two reasons. First, I think Sefnacht actively fought against Ursu after or at the same time as fighting Ta'usret, which fighting I think extended on past Bay's death. Second, and perhaps more important, they're being treated as two different people in Total War Pharaoh, and because this is basically coverage for that game, they're getting two separate videos in this series, so hang on until the Ursu video gets released for more about this controversy. Anyway, the point is that Siptah's reign is under threat. Loads of new people groups are entering into Canaan, and they are sometimes doing that entering with violence. The Libyans, though we don't hear much about them, are probably taking advantage of Egypt's weakness on the western border. The Nubians in the south may starting to become restless, maybe, we're not completely sure. But in the middle of it all, we get the decided sense that the two people really in charge of Egypt, that being Bay and Ta'usret, don't actually like each other very much. Now, some people, by the way, have speculated that Bay and Ta'usret had some sort of romantic relationship going on, which isn't very likely because of how protected Egyptian royal women were, and how badly it might be seen when one might be at risk from marrying outside the bloodline, but also because Ta'usret is probably the one who ended up getting Bay killed, though some people would say the woman murdering the man just makes it all the more likely that they were romantically involved. But all this military and civil disturbance sees Bay either granted or just assuming control over some body of soldiers, either as chief of Siptah's bodyguards or as being commander over all the armed forces of Egypt for at least some brief period. Now, whatever his nominal title in this regard, he doesn't seem to have had much, if any, success in the role, being unable to win any victories at all against Egypt's many enemies, and also being unable to turn any portion of the army personally loyal to him in the civil conflict. Now, after 5 years of being warred over Siptah, the young king is starting to reach an age where the regency is going to have to end, and the king is going to have to start taking over in his own right. Naturally, this would be a key pivot point for the two regions, with another claimant for the power rising who could theoretically side with one of them more than the other. The idea that both of them would be equally balanced is unlikely, and they're probably both ambitious enough that they're not interested in that. We sadly have no idea exactly what was going on behind the scenes, but in front of the scenes, we hear loud and clear that in Siptah's 5th year, Chancellor Bay is executed, nominally on the young king's orders, but pretty obviously on behalf of Regent Ta'usret. Bay may have been on the outs for a period ahead of his death, as we do have a recorded plaintive sort of plea in Bay's voice, which reads, "Come to me, Amun, and save me. I am a visitor from the northern country. Come and let me see the beautiful city while I see its women." The beautiful city here is the capital, and one interpretation of this is that he was unable to enter the city for a time, either a formal ban or a simple fear for his life, a fear that it's borne out in his execution. But moving from actual history back to Total War Pharaoh, Chancellor Bay is a pretty odd choice to include as a faction leader. He did hold a military post, briefly, but he may not have ever actually had any military control, as opposed to just claiming the title. He was a bureaucrat and a diplomat, a man of words, schemes, and influences, who may never have experienced direct violence prior to his execution. Then, to add to that, he's being classed in the Canaanite culture, not the Egyptian culture. Now, while he's likely from some portion of the Levant, he seems to have done his very best to integrate as completely as possible as an Egyptian, and we never see him doing anything distinctly foreign at any point in the record. Plus, if the early footage can be believed, he might be getting a starting location in Gubla, that's the historic town of Byblos, which is doubly strange as this is a pretty significant town in its own right, and it doesn't have any known connection to the good Chancellor at any point. Now, all that said, I don't really know where you would put Chancellor Bay at the start of the game. I don't really know why he would be included in a war game. Maybe when they make Total Politics Pharaoh, he can be a major player, or maybe he could exist as some kind of agent or diplomatic entity. But as a faction leader in a war game, whose primary responsibility is to raise and lead armies, it seems unfitting. But here we are still, and it's still a number of months as I write this before the game comes out. Maybe they have something exceedingly clever planned for him. Or maybe they'll give an interview where they'll admit that they don't really know what they're doing. They're just making the best of a kind of obscure period. Either way, I guess there will be a follow-up at some point, either before or after the game releases, in which I publish a Chancellor Bay reaction video, pretty much evaluating whatever they do decide to do with him in the context of this video right here. But at the very least, I'm glad that the inclusion of Chancellor Bay into the game has given me an opportunity to talk about him, as he transitions us from the first phase and into the second phase of the 19th Dynasty's collapse. And I hope you agree he was a pretty cool guy himself, as his own titles will attest. Now, he doesn't have any royal titles, he never rose quite that high, but we can still bid farewell to the royal butler, great chancellor, sole companion, who casts out falsehood and promotes truth, and who established the king in the seat of his father, whom he loved. Great chief treasurer of the whole land, chief of the bodyguards of the great king of the land of Egypt, Ramesses Hayem Netjer Bey. Thank you for watching.